Welcome to our 9th episode of By Way of Reminder. This is a weekly video podcast, show, episode, something of the elders of Boulevard Baptist Church. And it's been our pattern for the last few weeks to walk through our church covenant and talk about what our church covenant means and why that's important. Before I was a member at Boulevard, I don't even know if I knew what a church covenant was. And as we want to continue to emphasize the importance of membership among church members, the importance of living the Christian life in union with Christ and in communion with other believers, particularly the members here at Boulevard, we want to encourage you to do that well. And so we have this discussion talking through these things and hearing from these godly men and hearing their wisdom and insight. So tonight, it's the airing of this particular episode. The topic is about reasons to leave a church and what to look for in a new church. But before we get into that, why don't we read the line from our church covenant. Jason, would you mind to do that for us?
Sure. We will, when we move from this place as soon as possible, unite with some other church where we can carry out the spirit of this covenant and the principles of God's word.
All right. As I was thinking about this, there are several articles that I found were helpful from 9 Marks, and they've done a lot of good things on church membership, and it really helped me think about why these kinds of things are important. But let's talk for a few minutes about leaving a church. For some, that's kind of taboo to even talk about. But if we're going to equip our members to live godly lives and to be united to a church, there may be reasons to think about this. Maybe it begs the question to start, do we ever let people leave our church?
I don't see how you could prevent somebody.
Yeah. There's no way to monitor that.
No, you can't leave.
We're not a cult.
Yeah.
I just, like I said, it's hard to even monitor such a thing, and there are many different reasons why, depending on circumstance, people end up leaving a church. Some of them are legitimate, with whether there's some serious pastoral issues or some doctrinal questions and discrepancies that you may or may not agree on that are major doctrinal discrepancies, not minor tertiary things, but there's also some really unwise reasons too. And I think these 9 Marks articles by Jonathan Leeman especially, they really point out some of those not good reasons. And I think we can dive into those if we want.
Lance, what are some good reasons to leave a church?
I think doctrinal issues. When we think about the primary issues, secondary issues, tertiary issues, we think about secondary issues as the ones that actually divide us in our consciences, such that we have denominations. So we have denominational differences because of these secondary issues, and I think that secondary issues can be a reason to leave a church. Like your understanding of what the Bible teaches, if it is different from what your church is actually teaching, that could be a reason to leave a church.
Yeah.
What would you say, Jason, are some primary reasons, legitimate reasons, or primary doctrines that if they're not being taught correctly, they're legitimate to leave a church over?
The Trinity, who God is, the manhood and the incarnation of Jesus. Mm-hmm. So I would say that
when you say manhood, you're referring to his gender or his person, his incarnation?
His incarnation.
Okay. Just check.
Yeah.
The deity and the humanity of Christ.
Yes. I would also say justification by faith alone. Mm-hmm. That we are not saved by our works, but we are justified based off of what Christ has done for us. So there are core doctrines throughout, and hopefully in the coming weeks, we're going to be going through a lot of those doctrines, and some of those that are essential. And so I would say that if a church does not hold to those core doctrines, and what I mean by that is an error against those doctrines and preaching something that is essential for salvation, then that is a legitimate reason, and I would say you need to leave, and you need to leave quickly. You should flee and you should run from that. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think the things that you talked about are primary issues.
Yes.
And we would say that's not even a church.
Right. Yeah.
So, but secondary issues might be things like your understanding of baptism is a really common one that divides us denominationally, and so if your understanding of baptism is different, and that's not normally something that changes midstream for people, but it can, and that can be a reason to leave a church. Now, I would say that I'm primarily at this church because my doctrine changed, and I wanted to find a church that aligned with my doctrine that I had come to believe in. I have friends who I've teased in the past that it's a really nice feeling to go to a church where you actually believe what they're teaching, because that's not where everybody's at.
So what about, if I may, because Boulevard, we affirm Reformed theology. That's a pretty distinctive thing. And but what about some other, like, let's say Baptist churches that don't necessarily affirm like Arminian or Calvinistic theology, but if they're just a good old Baptist church, and you have one leanings to the other, how much should be emphasized of going to find a church that aligns with that, or how much should it be emphasized of you can agree to disagree? And
I think part of it is the weight on your own conscience.
Okay.
I think if you in good conscience cannot worship with and cooperate with in terms of ministry and affirm what's being taught, and it's putting a burden on your conscience, then I would encourage you. Some of those things have been. Some of their secondary issues are eschatology. People have left the church over, and in my mind, that's
tertiary.
That's tertiary, or even beyond that, perhaps, in terms of which millennial view you hold. But for some, that's a big deal.
And I know we're talking about Boulevard's covenant, so I don't want to step too far out of what we're talking about, but I know there's a lot of churches that they're just a Baptist or a Presbyterian or a Methodist church. They don't have certain distinctives, kind of like Boulevard maybe would affirm.
Yeah, and I wouldn't say that just because someone may not be Reformed, or a church may not be formed, I would not classify that as a bad church. I mean, we would disagree with that church on some what we would consider pretty significant theological issues, but we would not. But they are still within the realm of orthodoxy.
Absolutely.
So if someone I would never want to encourage someone to leave a church just because it was an unreformed church, unless their conscience was leading them that way.
Okay. And they had a strong desire to teach, and because they had some really strong leanings on a particular take the doctrines of grace. Somebody has come to a conviction about that, and they're in a church that does not openly espouse those things, and perhaps even more so, doesn't allow people to teach those things. Then that might be a legitimate reason to look for another church. And I would say the opposite could be true too. If you were at a church that espoused some Reformed theology and you weren't. Now, we've never made that a litmus test for joining Boulevard.
Right.
We have folks here at Boulevard that would not consider themselves in some of the same camps as we might. And we've not made that a litmus test or a line in the sand that says you must believe. We have a confession of faith. The Baptist Faith and Message is pretty broad in what we'll receive.
That's right.
So maybe those are some good reasons. What are some reasons I hesitate to use the word bad reasons, but occasionally there have been folks who have had, let's say, less than, that weren't the best, or maybe they weren't the wisest reasons. What are some of those that you guys think of?
Well, I would say one that can creep in that I think all of us should guard our hearts against is our own selfish wants and desires and in what we see in a church. And things outside of Scripture that we may impose on a church that isn't biblically based on what a church is or how it functions. Like, for example, if you want the color of carpet a certain way and the church vote doesn't go your way, so you're going to get upset and leave the church over that. That's not a valid reason to leave a church. And so and that's why we do this covenant, is because it helps us all understand that there are valid reasons and then there are invalid reasons to leave a church. And so, that I would say, there are definitely some invalid reasons. So,
I think church shopping is kind of part of this topic.
Oh, yeah.
It's kind of the phrase that people use. And so in my mind, one of the things that is maybe negative about the idea of church shopping is to look for something very specific that you want out of a church that may or may not be, like completely biblically based. For instance, you might want a very strong singles group or something like that. And so you're looking for a church that has a very strong in a very specific area. And I think the problem with that can be that church may not always be strong in that particular area as time goes by. So then what do you do then? Are you going to look for, the church that has the strongest aspect that you're looking for? Or maybe, you look for a strong singles group and then you accidentally get married and now you're looking for a church that has a strong...
Hopefully it wasn't an accident.
At least you wouldn't say it was that.
Now you're looking for a church that has a strong, young marrieds group, and then you have to find so I think the problem would be, you can always be looking for something that is a temporary characteristic that prevents you from really belonging to a church.
And there's always this, there may be romantic aspects of, and I don't mean romance in the sense of, intimacy or anything, but just these idealized versions of this is the perfect church. And until I find that church, I'm going to keep on looking.
Yeah. We talked about that earlier about rather than finding community, building it.
Yeah.
And I think that could be applied here.
So what are some other good reasons, other legitimate reasons for leaving a church?
Well, I think the intent of our actual covenant, it says when we move from this place. And I think moving is probably the spirit that they're after. So when you move to a different place is a good reason to move churches.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I would add to that. That's a hard decision, especially a church that you're committing to covenanting with. And I had a buddy of mine who recently got promoted, and the promotion required him to move out of state. And so it was not an easy decision because of the church that he was a part of. And so I do think that moving is a good reason to do that, but the Lord was calling him, I believe, called them providentially. It was a good opportunity for them and their family to go somewhere. I do think that there may be cases that where individuals are presented, and obviously this is up to their conscience, with opportunities to move for whether it's career advancement or whatever life circumstances they may entail, where someone may not choose to take that and move because of the church they're in, and where they're going might not be a place where that type of church is available.
Yeah.
So,
I would think in that situation, the one thing that I'd be concerned about is people didn't consider that at all.
right.
If you consider that and feel like you should move, if you consider that and feel like you shouldn't, I would affirm either of those, but I wouldn't affirm somebody not at least considering their church membership when they move.
Yeah.
So let's say somebody has come up to you and they say, I'm really thinking about leaving the church. What kind of counsel would you give them? What would you say to that person?
Well, I would. I would want to sit down with them and have not just one quick conversation, like, hey, so you want to leave? Okay, that's fine. No.
See ya.
See ya. Yeah. But no, I think you would sit down, figure out some of their reasonings, and if they were legitimate after talking through, maybe it's an issue that they have within the church, maybe it's like a moving type situation, a job type situation, and just kind of find that out. But if in good conscience they can't stay, let's say it's an issue within the church that they have, whether we think it's legitimate or not, meaning that it's an actual situation. If they feel like in good conscience they can't stay, and it's not strictly unbiblical, like a church discipline type of issue, then obviously I think we should encourage that. So, I mean, as long as they are with. But I would like to challenge someone if they are talking, and I would have a disagreement, and feel like that maybe they're trying to leave for an illegitimate reason, and remind them of the covenant that they have committed to. So, in a gracious and gentle way.
I think one of the reasons this is kind of a difficult topic to discuss is because the Bible doesn't give as clear of guidance with this, because there weren't two churches in Corinth to choose between, and so Paul never really had to write about this topic. But what he did write about was patience, yes, and long suffering, and the kind of relationships that we should have that aren't always perfect relationships. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of times the reasons people have for wanting to leave churches seem to be personal reasons or interactions with people. And I think that's where we would especially encourage people to be as biblical as possible, yes, in restoring relationships, in forgiving, in suffering long with people. That's the biblical guidance on those kinds of things.
Yeah. As best they can, to leave on good terms, to yes, reconcile the relationships, and it may not, that sometimes relationships are broken in such a way that reconciliation does not mean the level of friendship and intimacy they once had, but it means there's no ill will. They've forgiven each other for the wrongdoings, mm-hmm, and then can leave on good terms.
Yeah. I think another thing to ask them, if they're already in the process, if they have prayed about it, thought about it with their family and obviously to themselves, have you been in communication with your pastor about issues that are arising? Is this just a reaction that you're going to have, and I'm done, I'm out? Have you actually, and like we talked about with reconciliation, if there is hurt of past hurt issues, is that feeding your desire? And have you sought reconciliation, forgiveness, and forgiven those in your heart if you are truly legitimate about leaving?
Yeah, don't just disappear.
Yeah,
right.
Just decide you're going to flip a switch, and you're not going to ever go back there again. And you're not going to tell anybody why you're ever going back there again. And it's not till much later that some of these things come to light. So that's one of the things I would say don't do if they're going to leave a church, is don't just, without having talked to somebody, without seeking counsel from other Christian friends in the church that you can trust, don't disappear. What are some other things you would say don't do before or if you've decided to leave a church?
I would say cause divisiveness. It was kind of going what Nathan was saying and you, Matt, about reconciliation. I am aware of some situations someone wasn't happy and they tried to stir up even more divisiveness within the congregation, and I would say that would be something not to do. I mean, that's not helpful. It's not helpful. I get if someone in good conscience cannot go somewhere due to a conviction that they have, but in that does not give that individual a right to be divisive and cause disunity within the congregation. And so, to me, if someone became very divisive while they were departing, that would be a sin issue.
So how forthright should the person be? Should they go up to Lance and just say, Lance, I think you're a terrible preacher. I think you shouldn't ever teach or be involved in leadership in the church, and I'm going because of it. Is that helpful?
I mean, maybe there's better ways.
Sounds like a good thing.
Maybe there's better ways to say it than that.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, in a private, maybe even one-on-one conversation, maybe those things are said. Hopefully not that much animosity in them, but definitely with other members and friends, I think you have to tread very graciously and very lightly with what you say. And maybe there are times where answers are merited, like you can't not explain yourself. You can't hide in silence for what's going on. I mean, you might have to legitimately answer the why question to others, and that's fine, but just acting with as much goodwill and not trying to be disunifying to the body, and not trying to just peep on your way out and pull others with you. I think it's more of the passive aggressiveness of the peeping, the little gossip on the way out, rather than this church is horrible, I'm going to post it all over Facebook, I'm going to just be so public. It's more of the little tiny things that go on that are more hurtful in some ways, I think.
I would say context matters. So if you had a pastor who was, let's say, living immoral and was not teaching the truth of Scripture, not how you interpret Scripture, but I'm saying like some of the core doctrines, the primary issues that we were talking about, then that would be someone where I do think a forceful confrontation, and maybe in certain and extreme circumstances, a public declaration. If someone is preaching and teaching and leading the Lord's people in a way that is anti-gospel, so contrary and is a wolf in sheep clothing, I do think that there may be a time to proclaim that, and to proclaim that even loudly and forcefully. But those are generally rare in nature, and so that takes a lot of discernment and patience, and also wisdom in when you approach and encounter those type of situations.
I think generally speaking, the aim would be to be helpful.
Yeah.
There are ways in which you can bring legitimate criticisms to light without being hurtful, assuming it's not something as horrible as what you're describing, Jason. Assuming that it's a minor, relatively speaking, a minor thing. I think there may be times where you're able to speak with someone, and like you said, context matters. You don't want to pull a pin and walk away and leave a mess for somebody to clean up if you can help it. And so there are some ways, some good and bad ways to go about doing that. Lance, it looked like you had something.
Well, and I don't know if this is a good spot to fit it in, but whenever I think about this topic, I think about my parents who moved to their town in 1979 and joined a church within a month and are still members of that church today. And it wasn't because it's been rosy the whole time. They've lived through some pastors that, there was personality differences and some, obviously difficult things that can happen in churches over the period of decades. But they stayed and were faithful. And I think they have a reputation of faithfulness and trustworthiness that if they had bounced around to a different church every time that things were difficult, they wouldn't have that reputation. They wouldn't, kind of be the people that the church looks to them as now.
That's awesome.
Is there ever a time that you would discourage someone from leaving their church to join our church?
Depends on how much I like them.
I think definitely for those primary ones, and I don't think it should be necessarily thinking of it selfishly, like for our gain, because we want more people just because. If we understand the context that they're currently in a church that's going through some big issues pastorally, or if you know of some inside, what's the word, personal reconciliation issues in the church, and that's been resolved, and they're looking for a place now. I think those are some times when, like you said, context matters. Yeah. So there's going to be specific times when the timing is really important of when you promote, why don't you come to our church? You shouldn't just be blaring that as a trumpet all the time, per se, and being seasoned with salt, I think, is important on how you approach that discussion.
Well, and I would say if let's say somebody lives an hour from Springfield, and they pass 12 great churches on the way here, which is going to take them out of their community, and it's going to be really difficult for them to be intimately involved in the church. And I'm not saying I would prohibit them from joining, but I would just wonder why they would want to come all the way into Springfield for that, when knowing that their ability to really be connected may be very limited. I mean, if somebody called me from Texas and said, "Hey, I want to join your church,"
geography matters.
Yeah, and so there have been times where folks have told us, that live in Nixa, Republic, or Marshfield, that have said, we've been a part of Boulevard and we're not leaving under bad terms, but we would really like to be able to go to church closer to our home, that invests in our community. Again, I think those are legitimate reasons, and so. I think if you knew somebody was coming a long distance to be a member of your church, I would want to ask why us, and why not there?
And if
I believe that too.
Go ahead.
I just believe that the distance is something to consider, and there are people that are members of our church that travel a long ways, and I don't think they're the wrong place at all because of that, because there's a lot of factors that go into that. But I think when you are choosing a church, I think distance has to be something that you give some thought to. Ideally, if everything was the way it was supposed to be, there would be a neighborhood church, and there would be the community would literally be the community. I think that's the ideal thing. So I do think distance is a factor.
I think it was Paul Washer that once said, though, on the flip side, for people that do maybe distance isn't as much of a factor, or if it's still close but they're looking for other churches, I think Paul Washer said this: don't go to the church closest to your home. Go to the church nearest to the Bible, closest to the Bible. And I think there is some truth in that. And that's like you said, it's a tough decision, because it may very well be that the best church closest to the Bible is 45 to an hour away. And that's a tough decision. Yeah. How much do you invest in the community aspect and the being in that town versus the church itself? Yeah.
So let's change gears a little bit here, moving from leaving a church to looking for a church. What are top 3 or 4 things that you would encourage somebody to look for in a church?
I think distance is an issue, but literally, when I may be, I was just thinking that this is probably really close to my 9-year anniversary of belonging to this church. So it was about 9 years ago that I was considering these things, and distance actually was one. And there were churches that were closer to my home that just weren't the right fit for what we were looking for. But we did consider distance. But I think the most significant thing that we considered was doctrine. We were
Yeah.
looking for some place that had doctrine that we believed in. And ultimately, it's because doctrine is important. It's the truth. It's what you believe is the truth. It's what shapes you, and it's also ultimately what shapes the church. So I think a church with good doctrine has a lot better possibility of being long-term faithful because of their good doctrine than a church that is not as good with their doctrine. I think mature leadership is a significant thing. I looked for a church that I felt like had multiple mature leaders that were members of the church. So those are 3 things I was thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with everything that Lance just said. He stole a lot of mine. I would also put discipleship.
Yes.
And also, and not just discipleship from the top down, from the pastors down, but discipleship with one another is something. And that does not mean that every church does that perfectly. And I'm not saying that, but that is a consideration that I would find important. And the sense of community, love for one another, a willingness to gather towards one another. I mean, if I go to a church and they're, let's say, a church of 300, but only 20 people are showing up, and I would have some questions like, okay, why, what is the reason? And it could be that they've been on the rolls for years and everything like that, or it could be that there are some significant issues that we need to consider. So I would say, does the body love to gather together to worship the Lord, and also is Christ preeminent in worship?
That's right.
You know, I like when I come to worship, is the Lord glorified? Do we preach Christ? Do we talk about Christ? Is the gospel central to what we do on Sundays? And I would say that is a very, which gets back to Lance's point of doctrine.
Is the Bible central in anything and everything you talk about in the service, or is it just a jumping point to get to your TED Talk in a sermon?
Right.
Another thing I would say, and you guys put input on this, but I think the sign of a healthy church in some ways, not in all ways, but multi-generational, I think. If there's, it's not just the young church, or it's not just the seniors church. I think there is that. I think that's in some ways a test of the discipleship. If they're preaching and teaching it to other generations, I don't think that's as big of a deal as the things you just said. But I think Boulevard is well represented across denominations, or not denominations, ages, not denominations. Wow, that's a big issue there. That can be edited out, maybe.
I would also add probably one other thing that I personally looked for, and I do find it important, is expository preaching. Preaching the text verse by verse all the way through. That does not mean that a church cannot be faithful in topical preaching. Just I don't see it done very well. Very many places that do it. So
for corporate Sunday morning gatherings, going through the Bible.
Yes. Taking a text within context and preaching out of that text is, I think, very important. Again, I want to be just very clear. That does not mean that there's not times that topical preaching it cannot be beneficial. It's good. We've done some topical preaching here before, and it's been edifying and everything. It's been done well, I believe, and biblical. It's been biblical. So, but I've been in some churches that you've had a topic, and then you start pulling texts from all over the Bible to try to support that topic. And what you actually find out is, I've seen this personally, is they're pulling texts out of context that may actually be saying the direct opposite thing and contradicting what they're trying to get across. So finding an expositional preaching church is important and a way to protect yourself. So.
If Doug was here, I was going to say that you should also look for a church that is all cowboys.
Unless you're talking about football.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Gail would like that, though.
Yeah, Gail would like that.
And my wife
Gail,
would like that.
Gail would like that.
So how much church shopping or church hopping should a person do before they land on a church?
You know, like I said, we went through this about 9 years ago, and it was really difficult because we had a whole list of churches that we wanted to visit, and we would wake up on Sunday morning and say, "Can we just go to Boulevard today?" And so we ended up not going to all the churches that we wanted to because we just, we found ourselves wanting to come here. So I think I would say, normally I would have said, yeah, you're going to have to visit a lot of churches. But I think in some ways that you might find a church that you really love, and that might be where you stay, regardless of the 3 others that you were supposed to, try out.
Yeah, I'd say do enough.
Yeah,
Enough.
That's right.
But yeah, like the covenant says, though, as soon as possible. I mean, obviously that possibility may be a month. That possibility may take a whole year. I mean, it just depends on the situation, I think. And I've never gone through that, so me saying that's kind of, take that with a grain of salt. But
Yeah, and I think again, we'll go back to context matters. I mean, for other people who shop around for churches, I mean, we use that term and sometimes it as a negative, rightfully so, connotation with it. But I would say that context does matter because you might find your place, like if you're a college student that is in an area or a school. I remember going to, and we went to several churches, but there was some bad teaching going on in some of those churches, some prosperity gospel, that type of stuff. And so we were like kind of at a loss. Well, thankfully Doug recommended a church and faithful church. And so we would drive the 35, 40 minutes, but we kind of shopped around, looking around for that. And so, I don't want to come down on anybody that looks for certain churches, but like what we've been discussing tonight, there are legitimate reasons to be looking and kind of shopping around and just being wise in determining what those reasons are. And then there's illegitimate. So like such as, does a church have a light show?
Do they have a coffee shop?
We only have
Yeah,
floodlights here at Boulevard, and they're
yes.
pretty white and yellow colored, and that's about all you got.
So, let's say a person's moving out of state. How much involvement should our church have in helping them find another church?
That's a good question. I know there are resources. You may be in a situation where we actually know somebody in that area or can recommend. So I think that probably depends on where they're moving to. I know that there's resources to find a list of churches that kind of conform to certain characteristics, and those may be very helpful. But you don't really know until you actually go there. So I would hate to say, this church checks these boxes, and so from 1,000 miles away, I can tell that they're a healthy church to recommend. I think you'd have to be careful about that.
Well, and hopefully, as a person, whether they're a college student or whether it's a family that's moving away, hopefully in their time at Boulevard, and I'm not saying that we're perfect, but hopefully they've come to think about what a healthy church looks like, even in areas that maybe we're not as healthy as we should be, but are able to see, there are some things that I've learned that are necessary, that are important, and while they won't, I mean, nobody's ever going to be there's only one Boulevard, right?
Yeah.
For good or for ill, but hopefully there are some things that that you learn that are important and become priorities in what you look for. And there are websites, you didn't mention them, but a couple of them come to my mind. One is the Gospel Coalition, has a church directory, so you could pull up Dallas, Texas, and every church and they don't screen these, so anybody that wants to can list their name there. But generally, a church isn't going to list their name to say on the Gospel Coalition.
They don't like the Gospel Coalition, but we'll put our church on there. So they normally would agree with the Gospel Coalition.
So Gospel Coalition has one. 9 Marks, I believe, has another one.
Doesn't Founders?
Founders Ministries has one. So there's a few resources out there that can help. Now, sometimes you go into town, and as you pointed out, there are some towns that you really struggle to find a church, and it may be that for a while that you try your best to continue to stay connected with your home church, but that's probably not a long-term sustainable way of doing things. Eventually, you're going to have to find a church that is as close as it can be to what looks healthy and is doctrinally sound and these things, and maybe the Lord has intended you to go there so that you could bring some reform, some improvement, some contribution to that church. So, as we're just wrapping this up, there are legitimate reasons to leave a church. They may not all be doctrinal. There may be circumstantial things that make it reasonable to do so. But the things that the covenant is asking is that you would make church a priority, whether it's you're continuing to be a part of this one or one somewhere else, because the church is foundational to the life as a Christian.
Amen.